Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sally Burdett.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. Explosions in Beirut. Israel launches heavy strikes on the Lebanese capital. In the south of the country, civilians told to flee their homes and head north.
One of the men tipped to become Hezbollah's new leader was reportedly the target of those Israeli strikes in Beirut.
The European Union presses ahead with plans to impose steep tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, despite a divided vote.
China condemns the decision, accusing the EU of violating World Trade Organization rules and delaying its own green transition.
Relief for now, as US dock workers end their strike action until next year.
And a ruling that could change world football. Europe's top court says FIFA's transfer rules breach EU laws on freedom of movement.
The European Union is moving ahead with a plan to impose higher tariffs on electric vehicles made in China, despite an inconclusive vote by its members. The EU accuses Beijing of handing out unfair subsidies and wants to close the price gap between Chinese and European-made cars. But Brussels says talks between both sides will continue to try to find what it calls an alternative solution to higher import duties. The bloc's vote on Friday saw big divisions emerge between the 27 EU nations.
Now, according to sources, 10 members, including France, voted in favour. Germany, Europe's biggest automaker, was among 5 countries who reportedly voted no, while 12 members are said to have abstained. Almost 440,000 EVs were exported from China into the EU last year. That's worth $10.8 billion. The European Commission proposed tariffs of up to 35.3% on those cars, on top of the EU's standard 10% car duty. Now, despite the vote passing, talks between the EU and China are set to continue, including looking again at minimum import prices and a potential volume cap.
Well, in a moment, we'll be live in Berlin with our correspondent Peter Oliver. But first to Paris and Ross Cullen. So, Ross, France reportedly among the countries that voted in favour of the tariffs alongside Italy, Greece and Poland. Tell us more about how this vote shook out.
Well, the issue with the votes earlier today, Paul, what Sally mentioned when she was running through some of the numbers, the high number of abstentions. There were countries like France and Italy that voted in favour of the tariffs, Germany and Hungary voting actively no against the tariffs. But because there were so many abstentions, it meant that it came to a casting vote. And that vote was cast by the European Commission themselves, the executive arm of the European Union. And because they have been in favour of the tariffs throughout, that meant that this plan to introduce new taxes was approved and will come into effect in November. More duties to be imposed on Chinese-made cars being exported from China into the European Union, all part of a plan to try to protect the European Union's auto industry. Now, all of this was taking place in Brussels, and we did have a news conference just afterwards, just after the votes from the European Union spokes team. We did hear, first of all, from Eric Mamer. He was saying that this was an extremely straightforward procedure to increase the EU's competitiveness. We also heard from his colleague, Olof Gill, and we can listen in now to a little bit more of what Mr. Gill had to say.
The reason we continue negotiating in good faith and in a meaningful, constructive way with our Chinese counterparts is precisely because we want to find a solution. We're open to finding a solution.
Now, what you did hear there is an allusion to the fact that there could well be further talks down the line between Brussels and Beijing. The door still slightly ajar for an alternative solution proposed by the European Commission spokesman there. But there overall remains this issue that there are many different sectors that are impacted when it comes to investigations by China or by the European Union. Wind turbines and solar panels, dairy products, cognac even being exported from France. Could that face reciprocal duties imposed by Beijing as a result of today's news? But the key central issue on Friday, these new duties to be imposed by the European Union on Chinese-made electric vehicles coming here to Europe.
Ross, thank you so much for that. Ross Cullen, our Paris correspondent.
Let's get the view from Germany now, and our correspondent Peter Oliver joins us from Berlin. Hello, Peter. So it's so interesting how Germany's position has actually changed. In July, they abstained from a vote on this very issue, and now they're saying a flat no. Tell us about this.
Yeah, right up until yesterday, right up until Thursday, we were really expecting a German abstention. Then the news started to come out that it would be a no from Berlin. The reasons for this are probably twofold. One is a lot of pressure has been exerted from the big players in the German auto industry, one of the largest industries in the country. The other is political, because if Olaf Scholz and his Social Democratic Party were seen to essentially have given up on the auto industry, that would not reflect well with the unions who represent the automobile industry, who are incredibly powerful here. And we have a big election coming up in Germany next year, federal election in which Olaf Scholz's job is on the line. Now, what this does is it puts Germany in a group they don't usually find themselves in. It's a group along with Slovenia, Slovakia, Malta and Hungary. And the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban furious about these tariffs.
Let us make it clear. What we are doing now and what they're making us do, what the European Union is doing, is an economic Cold War. This is the worst thing that can happen to Europe. That should be their problem. But this also affects us, Hungarians.
So, as you mentioned, the massive industry, the auto industry in Germany, has powerful unions. What are the car makers in Germany saying?
Well, they're absolutely outraged at this. We've heard from the big players like Mercedes, like VW, like BMW as well, all encouraging Olaf Scholz, encouraging the German government, encouraging the European Union not to push ahead with this. The reasons are quite clear when you look at the money that comes into Germany from this industry. 29 billion, just over $29 billion worth of cars and auto parts were exported from Germany alone to China, and they fear that that could be at risk. It's not just the big automakers who've been voicing their discomfort, their dissatisfaction. Also, the organisations that represent the auto industry here in Germany have been saying that this could ultimately be self-defeating.
Today's decision may be the beginning of a further escalation in the trade disputes with China. We need to hold critical discussions here, but we do not consider the instrument of introducing tariffs to be appropriate. And the news is also difficult for consumers, because the tariffs will make electric cars more expensive.
Well, this vote has gone through. The tariffs will be in play by the end of this month, beginning of next month. But what the hope is, certainly even among senior political figures here in Germany, Robert Habeck, the Vice-Chancellor, speaking just yesterday, is that they can continue to keep negotiating, and hopefully China and the European Union can come to a solution that doesn't involve these tariffs and run the risk of reciprocal tariffs coming back on German, European goods heading over to China.
All right, thank you so much for that view from Berlin. That's our correspondent, Peter Oliver, there.
Well, let's get a look at the big picture now with Hosuk Lee Makiyama, Director of the European Centre for International Political Economy. Great to have you back on the programme, Hosuk. Thank you very much for joining us. So it's fair to say, isn't it, that the EU is not united on these tariffs, with 10 members in favour, 5 against, 12 abstaining. How can we interpret this split, and what might it tell us about the bloc's internal dynamics around trade with China?
Well, what we have seen in the last couple of weeks is that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have been actually making last-minute calls across the European capitals to basically rally up support against these tariffs. But what we have also seen in the last minute here in Brussels is that, the countries have basically reckoned that the numbers don't really add up, and therefore chosen to abstain rather than support Germany. So what we can see here is that internal discipline, party whip, if you like, within the EU member states have really started to work, and they are actually not just fearing Chinese retaliation, but also breaking ranks amongst the EU member states.
And what do you make of the disagreement on this between France and Germany, and why do you think Germany took this stance? And what impact could that have on the EU's car industry, of course, which Germany sits at the apex of?
Well, of course, and it's quite interesting how the German industry have chosen a strategy that is perhaps more akin to, let's say, a high-tech company like Apple, which designs everything in their home country, but then manufacture quite a lot of their parts and final assembly inside China. And we have seen a company like, for example, Volkswagen and its group of companies, including Skoda and also Audi, has started to manufacture high-end models inside China because China has the scale, it has the know-how, it has the battery technology, and it's actually quite a decent economy to produce automobiles out of. So even the German labor unions in the Volkswagen, who's, by the way, shareholders of Volkswagen, together with some of the German sub-states, have basically green-lighted this kind of supply chain outsourcing, if you like, making in China. And of course, we shouldn't forget that for the most European auto manufacturers who are export-led, so for example, like Volkswagen and Audi, BMW, China represent now the world's largest market outside of Europe. And Volkswagen is, for example, China's second largest brand, selling about 1 million cars per year.
Now, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has warned of an economic Cold War with China. Do you believe that these tariffs could escalate into a full-blown trade war?
I hate to break it to you, but, we've been in an economic Cold War with everyone and everywhere since 1968. This is basically the normal state of things in trade negotiation. It's commercial rivalry, and it happens. And every action is followed up by a counter-reaction. And we are expecting China to retaliate against Europe on perhaps, dairy was mentioned several times, but also pork. Other items that have come up is, for example, graphite, that could basically cripple the manufacturing of automobile batteries inside of Europe. And there are several signs of export controls on graphite kicking in sooner rather than later. But one thing that we know about Chinese retaliation, however, is that they tend to be quite measured. China knows that there are other cards up Europe's sleeve, and they prefer not to escalate things to deteriorate even further.
Okay, so there are cards up their sleeve. You've been involved in these trade negotiations before. What happens next? What are the most important next stages to this dispute? And are there any opportunities for an off-ramp to be found?
Well, for these tariffs to entirely go away, that's perhaps too much of an idyllic scenario. That basically doesn't happen. And a lot of reports that we have seen in media tend to think of that as an end state, whereas actually in real life or trade negotiation, it's just about finding a balance between Europe and China where they can actually live with the measures and the countermeasures without the situation escalating further. So I don't think these tariffs will entirely go away. But as we see Chinese manufacturers investing more inside Europe, BYD has invested, for example, in Hungary, and they are probably looking at investing in France, which is probably, from political reasons, quite a good idea. And you will see these tariffs to be phased out. And to tell you the truth, this is the path that the Japanese and the Koreans, all the other auto manufacturers from East Asia had to go through to be accepted in Europe as a domestic player by localizing into the local economy, by building plants inside Europe and hiring European workers. And Europe is unfortunately not making any exception for China this time.
All right, well, thanks so much for laying all of that out for us. Always great to have you on. Hosukli Makiyama, Director of the European Centre for International Political Economy.
Well, China has reiterated its opposition to the tariffs. In a statement, the Commerce Ministry accused Brussels of protectionist practices, violating World Trade Organization rules and delaying its own green transition. Beijing also said the measures would weaken Chinese investor confidence in Europe. Negotiators from both sides are due to meet on Monday. Now, I've been getting a view from Chu Qiang, who is Assistant Director of the International Monetary Institute in Beijing.
I'm very hopeful that both sides will keep on talking, because I think both trade partners, both sides of the trading partners, will expect to, the easier solution. But still, I think we can go in hard way. For example, we can pose another retaliating, tariff on, European products. For example, the pork from Denmark, from the Swedish market will be a good target. And I think this has already been generating some effect. So I think Spain are responding very positively to Chinese proposal, because Spain is also one of the major pork exporter to Chinese market. So I don't think both sides would like to see this happening in the hard way. So I think everyone will still resort to an easier and a more reasonable solution towards this end.
If these tariffs do go ahead, they will kick in at the end of October. Obviously, they are capped at a sort of an extra 33%. Not all companies are going to be subject to those very high tariffs if they go ahead. But let's presume the worst-case scenario. What impact is this going to have on the Chinese EV market?
As for sure, according to my modeling, I think probably is going to generate like a 10% the reduction in the sales of the EV into the European market in the beginning of the 3 months. So I think in the future, Chinese EV makers will also will continue to negotiate with European counterparts for sure. But also another scenario for them is that more of the EV makers from China will shift their capacity into European market. For example, BYD have already been building up the capacity in Hungary, and more is to come in Serbia. And I think some other companies will going to build their capacities and presence in not only the Hungary but also in Netherlands, as well as in France and Germany. So I think shifting the capacity towards the European market and localize the capacity is another option for them as well. This is not just like you versus me, Europe versus Chinese, EV makers, but it's more like, we're killing each other out of the political reasons, from the European Commission. Look, out of the most major Chinese EV makers like BYD, like Leapmotor, like the NIO, like the NIO, and most of these companies actually has been a joint venture by both Chinese and European investors together. And also talking about the European EV makers, for example, like Stellantis, they also have the money invested from China. So it's more like you and me and you. And for many of the most important automakers, for example, from the Germany, like Mercedes, for example, the BMW, and the EV brand they're going to make, many of most important EV parts, actually, like the infotainment systems, like the chassis, like the motors, they're importing from China. So actually, Chinese supply chain are helping the old and the most famous EV, the auto brand, to reduce their EV cost. For example, like the Mercedes and the BMW. So I think these tariffs posed on Chinese EV brand, it looks like they're helping the EV automakers to reduce the competition within the EU market, but actually they're being killing their own profit and also uplifting their own cost for building their own brand. So I think this is a lose-lose scenario we're looking at if they're going to reverse the whole scenario. And I think a bargain, and a successful bargain and negotiation, is what we need most and urgently right now.
Manuel Muniz is the former Secretary of State for Global Spain at the Spanish Foreign Ministry. He says an escalation of trade tensions will not benefit either side.
So this is very significant, and I think on the part of the EU, it is very emblematic, because the EU is the world's largest trading power. The EU has by far the largest proportion of its GDP that is dependent on trade. This is more significant for the EU than it is for China or the US or any of the other major trading actors around the world. So the fact that the EU is considering these measures, I think, is very telling of how the EU sees the international environment. And I think there are two paths ahead of us here. One is a path where we entrench our trade policies, where there are tariff and non-tariff barriers that are imposed because of concerns about unlevel playing field in other markets, etc. Or we recommit to opening our markets, but establishing fair competition. And by the way, this is a question for both Europeans, but also for China, because as you know, what has driven the EU to impose these measures is its perception that it is competing in a very unlevel playing field when it comes to Chinese exporters because of state aid to exporters in China, access to soft loans provided by state or semi-state owned financial institutions in China, issues related to the currency in China, and many others. Also issues related to market access on the part of European manufacturers and others to the Chinese market. So this idea of the unlevel playing field has been very present. So I think these two paths open ahead of us. One basically means recommitting to international fair trade, and the other leads us down a path of international trade fracture, which will be, I think, very damaging for everybody. So I think in the next few years, these things will play out, and we will know the path that we have chosen. And there will be consequences on prices, on inflation, on access to products, on the intensity of innovation on both sides of this discussion, depending on which path we choose.
It seems like over the past years, and both parties have been treating accusations. And in September, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez paid an official visit to China. He said, I'm quoting him, "We don't want a trade war that would benefit no one." So how does Spain position itself in China-EU relations?
I think those words echo the perception, I think, here definitely of the government. Which is Spain is a trading nation. It is very much European in that sense. We have a large proportion of our economy linked to external trade, not just with China, I mean, across the board with the US, with Latin America. We have a long-standing trade and investment relationship. And we think that our strategic autonomy, the resilience of our economy is built on the diversity of the markets that we access and the economic relationships we have all over the world. So I think that visit and that message was a call for the building of a fair, more balanced, but open trade relationship. The Prime Minister was in China also last year, and he sent a very similar message. And he said, to a large extent, what happens here is also in China's hands, because if China recommits to its openness, there's a much higher chance of us saving the international trading regime than if it doesn't. So, as you were saying before, I think there are responsibilities on both sides of this debate. But Spain's initial stance is that we would rather enhance the international trading regime than seeing it fall to pieces.
And we'll pick up on our top story later in this program. A look at other news for now. The European Union's top court has ruled that Facebook owner Meta must limit its use of personal data for targeted advertising. The Court of Justice ruled in favour of privacy campaigner Max Schrems, who said Meta had misused data about his sexual orientation in order to personalise adverts on his newsfeed. Meta said it had invested more than $5 billion to increase privacy protection in its products.
Meanwhile, Meta has unveiled a new AI video generator which will be rolled out next year. The Movie Gen can create and edit up to 16 seconds of video and add sound and photos by text prompt. Analysts say the development puts Meta on course to challenge rivals OpenAI and Google in the race to develop the new wave of consumer AI products.
One of the world's biggest producers of quartz says stocks of the mineral haven't been affected by Hurricane Helene. Sibelco's mine in North Carolina was damaged when the storm hit the United States. Quartz is used in a variety of products, including clocks, radios and microprocessors. The company hasn't said when the mine will reopen.
Shares in the French video game maker Ubisoft have jumped 30% over talks of a private buyout. The company's founding Guillemot family and Chinese tech firm Tencent, both of which are already minority shareholders, are considering the move after Ubisoft lost more than half its market value this year.
Japan's Prime Minister has asked ministers to put together a new economic stimulus package aimed at easing the high cost of living. Shigeru Ishiba, who was sworn in last week, is usually regarded as a supporter of fiscal austerity, but the new package is expected to include handouts for low-income families and local government subsidies. This comes ahead of a general election in Japan at the end of this month.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. Explosions in Beirut as Israel launches heavy strikes on the Lebanese capital, while civilians in the south are told to flee their homes and head north.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
Israel's military is engaged in some of its heaviest bombing yet of Beirut. Multiple blasts have been heard, including one near the international airport.
Away from the capital, another Israeli airstrike cut off a key road out of Lebanon, which thousands of civilians have been using to flee to Syria. Israeli forces have ordered the evacuation of more than 30 towns and villages in southern Lebanon as battles on the border with Hezbollah intensify.
Well, our correspondent in Beirut is Evangelo Sipsas. Evangelo, a fresh wave of strikes causing significant damage. What more can you tell us?
Significant damage indeed. And actually, speaking about evacuations, there has been circulated in the past few hours that certain areas in the Dahiya district, it was sent out by the IDF in Arabic, that certain areas need to be evacuated. This is a tactic by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, before they usually target a building or the bomb an area. So just give you the updates of what's going on really right now on the ground. But as you mentioned, there's been heavy airstrikes taking place here in the capital of Lebanon, in Beirut. On Thursday, we saw one of the largest explosions so far after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. It was believed that they were targeting Hashem Safieddine, who is the natural successor of Hezbollah. They used similar missiles to those that they used during Nasrallah's killing, these bunker blast missiles to be able to explode, to be able to reach deep into earth, believing that he might be in some sort of bunker. There hasn't been any confirmation of the Hezbollah side if he's indeed been targeted, but the IDF says that that is the person. They have not confirmed if he's alive or dead either. But it was a very heavy explosion. We felt it from our hotel. The building was shaking quite a lot. It was a night really that was really strong. A lot of airstrikes taking place. But throughout Friday as well, another number of airstrikes have been taking place in Dahiya, again, the district that is controlled, or the stronghold, by Hezbollah. A number of buildings came down. As the IDF has been saying, they targeted specific people within the Hezbollah hierarchy. precision airstrikes, but a lot of the buildings that they've targeted here in Beirut were civilian buildings, and it's literally close to the airport, actually, one of those strikes that took place. And near that strike that took place close to the airport, a hospital was also targeted, or was destroyed, actually, by the blast, and is now out of service.
Meanwhile, Evangelo, Iran's foreign minister is there, has met with Lebanon's prime minister in Beirut. What do we know about that meeting?
Well, it is a significant meeting. And why is it significant? Because this arrival of the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, shows that Iran supports and backs Hezbollah fully. And it's quite significant because it's not a message that he gave out from Iran. He came in person here. So that shows even more commitment towards backing up Hezbollah, and especially when these tensions that are continuing to grow with Lebanon and in Gaza, and specifically in this press conference that he gave, which is not that long, I have to say, he mentioned that the only way to actually have a ceasefire here in Lebanon is if there is a complete ceasefire in Gaza. So he put those in the same sentence. He said, if you want the one, you're going to have the other. And it shows how much he supports and is backing Hezbollah at this given moment. But he also targeted Israel a little bit. He mentioned specifically that what Iran did on Tuesday was rather a defense rather than an offense towards Israel, saying that they're not the ones who were provocative. It was Israel who did it, and Iran's action it was a reaction from Israel's actions. He says that Iran is not the one who's targeting civilians, children, and residential areas, rather targeting specifically military outposts, rather than what Israel has been doing for the past few weeks here in Lebanon. And he also mentioned very, very clear here, and it was a message, it was pretty much a very strong message towards Israel, saying that if you dare to attack us or to do any retaliatory attack towards us, then we will immediately react without holding back. And it's significant because while he was speaking, a bombing was taking place near that airport. So it shows how significant this visit is and how much Iran is backing Hezbollah when it comes to sitting down on the table when it comes to negotiations.
All right, Evangelo, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Evangelo Sipsas reporting for us live from Beirut.
And Iran's supreme leader says his country has a legal and legitimate right to strike Israel. This after Tehran's huge missile attack on Tuesday this week.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that Iran and its allies would not back down. Our correspondent Ehsan Kevani reports from Tehran.
Well, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei led the Friday prayers in Tehran and delivered a public sermon. The leader appears in Friday prayers on very special occasions or to address very important issues. And as you mentioned, the last time he led the Friday prayers was in January 2020 after Iran targeted a U.S. military base in Iraq in retaliation for the strike that killed top IRGC commander General Qasem Soleimani. Today, the crowd in Tehran was huge, and people from across the country had come to attend the sermon. After Iran's large missile struck on Israel and talks of a possible reaction from Israel, many expected the leader's speech to be a kind of fiery speech, probably with a war decree, but the leader once again announced Iran's positions. Here is a highlight of his speech.
The Islamic Republic will strongly perform its duties in this regard. In performing our duties, we neither delay nor act hastily. Pay attention. What military and political decision makers in Iran recognize as logical and reasonable will be done in its right place and right time. As it was done, and if needed again, it will be done in the future.
Ayatollah Khamenei, who holds the country's highest authority, said that Iran's recent missile attacks on Israel was the minimum punishment, as we heard in the soundbite, and for what he called Israel's crimes. Many analysts inside Iran said although the Friday speech by the leader had a firm and serious tone, it could help reduce the regional tensions.
Now, the target of Israel's overnight strike in Beirut is believed to have been Hashem Safieddine. He's a potential successor to the late Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed last week. Now, it's not yet known if Safieddine was actually killed. Let's speak to our correspondent, Jonathan Regev, in Tel Aviv. Hello, Jonathan. What is the IDF saying about these latest airstrikes in Lebanon, and any update on Safieddine?
The update is that anyone who was in that bunker cannot walk out of there alive. This is due to the scope of the bombings, the fact that they penetrated deep into the ground. So anyone who was there was killed. The big question is, was Hashem Safieddine inside? No confirmation for that at the moment, not from Israel, not from Lebanon. Therefore, it is unclear. No confirmation, no denial, nothing. What Israel did say is that Hashem Safieddine indeed was the target. This is the man they were looking for. Not clear at the moment if he was really hit. The message, though, is very clear. Just as it was a week ago when Hassan Nasrallah was targeted, Israel is looking for the main leadership, loud and clear. In Hezbollah, it was a week ago when Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah chief for more than 30 years, was killed, along with many other Hezbollah officials. This was a move that Israel refrained from doing for more than 30 years, and now is happening. Now, Hashem Safieddine. We also know that other prominent Hezbollah officials, those who are still alive, may have also been there in the bunker overnight that was bombed. So Israel basically pointing with its actions that it is looking for every leader in Hezbollah, and if Hashem Safieddine indeed was killed and a new leader will be designated, he will become a target as well.
All right, thanks very much for that update. That's Jonathan Regev, our correspondent in Tel Aviv.
And you can get the highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. You can sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, striking a deal to end the strike. US port workers accept a pay hike, ending their 3-day walkout.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Paul Barber and Sami Baudet. The headlines once more. The European Union presses ahead with plans to impose steep tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, despite a divided vote.
China condemns that decision, accusing the EU of violating World Trade Organization rules and delaying its own green transition.
Let's get more on that story. Earlier this week, we spoke to Stephen Perry, chairman of the 48 Group Club, which works to strengthen China-UK business ties. He believes the EU tariffs are a mistake.
So when the Europeans put on the tariff, what do the Chinese say? Hold on a second. We've given your car companies a fortune in access to the Chinese market. We didn't put tariffs on them. You put tariffs on us. We'll put tariffs on you. And all the car companies in Europe said, don't put the tariffs on. But these rather silly people in the EU bureaucracy, following American advice, want to try and make life difficult for China. and it's involved in a battle with China, which I don't think it will win.
And you can see more of that interview on the agenda this weekend, right here on CGTN.
US employment has surged with more than 250,000 new posts last month. It's a key economic indicator for policymakers when it comes to setting interest rates. Our correspondent John Terrett is in New York to explain all of this to us. John, we often talk about jobs numbers, don't we, on Fridays? What's the reaction been to this latest lot?
Well, you're trusting me to explain it, Paul and Sally. I'll do my best. Look, Austin Goolsbee, who heads up the Federal Reserve in Chicagoland, my kind of town, he's just said on the radio here in New York that he thought this report was superb. It was absolutely perfect. It was just the best kind of report you could ever wish when it comes to jobs. But here on Wall Street, they're now busy. You can hear them screaming in the background. They're tearing up their bets for 50 basis point cuts in November and December, because clearly there's no need for an emergency 50 basis point cut anymore. And that does rather dovetail nicely with what Chairman Powell told us in Tennessee, in Nashville, home of country music, only last week, when he said that, I mean, I don't quite know how to phrase this really. He sort of hinted that he was kind of expecting a 25 basis point cut in November and again in December, 50 basis points. They don't meet in October, by the way. So 50 basis points by the end of the year. And the markets tanked on that, because the trouble is the markets then were expecting at least 75 basis points down, or if not 100. So today we have the opposite story, which is why it's kind of difficult to explain. So the economy put on 254,000 jobs in September, not 140,000 that we've been told to expect. This is the best since March. The rate of unemployment fell from 4.2% to 4.1%, and wages continued to go up, which is why Goolsbee is saying that this report is basically superb, because it kind of suggests that Goldilocks economy, you know, the soft landing that everybody's been hoping for. It looks as if the Federal Reserve may have achieved that, bringing interest rates, you know, down and inflation down over the course of the last couple of years. We had assumed that if this report was as it is, that there would be a sell-off based on the fact, here we go, based on the fact that if the economy is so strong, Chairman Powell, who's already said he's not in any hurry to cut interest rates, wouldn't cut interest rates and then would risk a downturn or a recession. Anyway, the opposite happened today, and I can only assume it's in praise of the Goldilocks economy and the fact that we seem to have a soft landing, because the markets are sharply ahead, at least they are at the moment. The next jobs report, by the way, is going to be on the 1st of November, which is a Friday, and that's not going to be clean, because Hurricane Helene, which of course has devastated the southeast, particularly in North Carolina, that's going to play into that one. So we're not really going to know much about the next jobs report. Anyway, for now, in praise of a Goldilocks economy, the Dow is ahead by, let's call it 0.5%. The S&P 500 is ahead by 0.5% as well. We've got the bonds elevated, and it does seem as if the economy is sort of recharging itself in just the sweet spot, just the right way at the moment. And can I quickly just tell you about crude oil very quickly? I know you wanted to deal with that on the program earlier. Just very quickly, President Biden has said publicly he's working with Israel to attack Iran's oil sites, not the nuclear sites, but the oil sites. And for that reason, crude oil is up sharply. We've got WTI here at $75 a barrel. Just last week it was at 60, and Brent is at $78 a barrel. Both of them right now up by about 1%. Paul and Sal?
So, John, no need to buy any, well, panic buy any toilet paper for now, it seems, John.
I know. You should have read that first. There's a lesson. Anyway, basically, yes, I caught you out with that one, didn't I? Basically, the strike has been posted, this docker strike, okay? We were very concerned about this docker strike, sealing all the ports on the East Coast and the Gulf. And then late last night, there were no talks going on late last night, and then suddenly they agreed to postpone the strike until January the 15th. Why did they do that? Well, I suspect the dead hand of the White House crushing down on the International Longshoremen Association and saying, you better stop this strike and stop it quickly, because the White House, I have no proof of this, by the way, this is pure speculation, but everybody thinks the same thing. The White House has enough on its plate with the election and, of course, the issue in the Middle East. Now, the last thing it wants is a strike that's going to push up prices in the stores right before the election. So they did a deal, the management and the unions. Over 6 years, the workers will get 61 to 62% pay increase. They're going to meet again after the election in mid-January. There is still a huge sticking point about automation, which could scupper these plans. But Biden is saying that this is a victory for collective bargaining, and that's something that he believes in very strongly. They didn't want to intervene in a negative way with the unions because they didn't want Kamala Harris, the Democrat candidate now, to be seen as anti-union. And it seems as if they've pulled all this off.
John, yes, you did get me good. Good to see you, though. John Terrett, live from the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Police in Pakistan's capital have fired tear gas as they clashed with supporters of jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Demonstrators took to the streets in defiance of a protest ban. Earlier, authorities sealed off entry points to Islamabad with shipping containers and blocked cell phone services to try to prevent the gathering. The city is on high alert ahead of high-level diplomatic events, including a visit from India's foreign minister. Khan has been held in prison for a year on charges that his supporters say are politically motivated.
Flash flooding and landslides have killed 14 people in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Villages and towns became inundated with water after an overnight storm caused rivers to burst their banks. Dozens more people are reported missing and a state of emergency has been declared.
The first diagnostic test for Mpox has been approved by the World Health Organization. The new PCR test will give an immediate result and could prove pivotal in stopping the global spread of the deadly virus. Currently, samples have to be sent for lab testing, with the results taking several days.
The G7 will set up specialised police units to investigate trafficking of migrants as part of efforts to clamp down on irregular migration. Italy's Interior Minister made the announcement at the end of a three-day meeting of the Group of 7 economies, which comprises the United States, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Italy and Canada.
Now, FIFA's transfer rules break EU laws on competition and freedom of movement. That's the verdict of Europe's top court in its ruling against football's governing body.
Yeah, the Court of Justice delivered its decision in a case linked to former France footballer Lassana Diarra. The Players' Union says it's a landmark moment.
Our correspondent Siobhan McCall has been following the story. Siobhan.
Yes, thanks, Paul and Sally. The dispute between ex-Real Madrid player Diarra and FIFA has been going on for close to a decade. In 2014, Diarra was playing for Russian side Lokomotiv Moscow. But after a dispute over an alleged pay cut, he terminated his contract 3 years early. And FIFA ordered Diarra to pay the club more than $10 million in compensation. Well, that's because of FIFA rules on players terminating their contract without just cause. In cases like this, players are liable to pay their old team compensation, and any new club they sign for also becomes jointly liable. Diarra tried to sign for Belgian side Charleroi in 2015. They asked for guarantees that they wouldn't be liable for the compensation, which FIFA couldn't give. The deal then fell through, and Diarra went to the courts to argue that this amounted to a restriction of trade. He sued FIFA for over $6 million in loss of earnings and damages. Well, the case was referred to the ECJ, and now it's ruled that some of FIFA's regulations go against EU laws on freedom of movement. It says the rules can stop career development for players because of the financial risk for them and future clubs. And the court said that while it appreciates that the regulations can help clubs maintain squad stability, the rules go beyond what is necessary to achieve that objective. Well, the case has been called the Bosman Rule. That was a 1995 case that changed the rules around free transfers when players' contracts have expired. Diarra's lawyer also represented Jean-Marc Bosman, and he says this judgment is a lot more far-reaching and that the whole transfer system will now have to change.
First, it's not only free movement of workers, it's also free competition. Second, it does not just say this and that precise FIFA rules are clearly illegal. It also says, but who the hell is FIFA to regulate this little market?
Yeah, strong words from Diarra's lawyer there, Siobhan. What could the implications be?
Well, Sally, it depends on who you're listening to. So FIFA issued a statement immediately afterwards, and they said that they were satisfied that the legality of key principles of the transfer system have been reconfirmed in today's ruling. They said the ruling only related to 2 of their articles in their rulings, so they don't seem, on paper at least, too concerned. Very different opinion from the Players' Union. They are more along the lines as Diarra's lawyer, as we just heard from him, saying the landscape of sport has changed. And a lot of analysts are going down this line as well, saying that we could now be looking at lower transfer fees, shorter contracts, real player power. So the big question, is this a case now where, you know, Real Madrid sign a player for $200 million and within a year they've fallen out, he walks away and he signs for another club for free? No, it's not. The ECJ was very keen to point this out, that actually, yes, in this case with Diarra, they felt the rules were applied too stringently. But this is not a free-for-all for players to kick up a fuss and move on. The cases have to be considered in future on, like, a strict basis, so we don't get this situation where players are super, super powerful. So we'll have to see what happens. The case actually now goes back to the original Belgian court, and they will decide. They're unlikely to go with anything different from what the ECJ says, so it's highly likely that Diarra will get his compensation. And what we can expect when that does happen is that other players who've been in that situation will then take legal action themselves. But whether this will have a long-term impact on the game, FIFA don't seem to think so. Others do. We'll have to wait and see.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Siobhan McCall.
Thanks, Siobhan. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the battle for blue skies, China's efforts to clean up air pollution and the implications for the rest of the world.
ناجي وحيد ما ولا يوم ولا أبا.
استشهدوا 96 نفر، من ضمنهم أمي، أبويا، خواتي الثلاثة، بولادهم الستة، أخويا، أولاده التنين.
فقدت كل شيء، أمي وأبوي وأخوي، عائلتي، بيتنا، غرفتي، شهاداتي، أواعيي، ولا حاجة طلعت. يا رب يا رب تخلص الحرب، يا رب يا رب تخلص.
Welcome back. Now, the UK government says it will invest $28 billion in carbon capture schemes over the next 25 years.
Yes, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has promised 2 so-called cluster areas in the north of England, which he says will help the country meet its climate goals. The process aims to capture CO2 released by industrial processes and power stations and store it deep underground. But some environmental campaigners say it will extend the life of fossil fuel production.
Between 2013 and 2021, China's air pollution levels fell by over 42%, part of its Battle for Blue Skies campaign.
The final episode of CGTN's series In Fact with Kyle Oberman looks at the data and what difference it can make for the world.
So there used to be this term called airpocalypse in China a decade ago. In 2016, the New York Times even ran a piece about the issue dramatically titled Life in China, Smothered by Smog. A decade later, an unprecedentedly short period for a nation of its GDP and size, China has brought these blue skies, cleaner air, across the country. Since 2013, the peak of the airpocalypse era, China has grown its GDP by 121%, claimed it's eradicated poverty in the nation, and reduced PM 2.5 small particulate matter in its air by 57%. How did they do it? Let's go back to July 2008, a month before the Olympics in Beijing began. Groups of athletes were wary of participating in the Games unless Beijing's air improved. Now, this air pollution was due to the fact that in the decades prior, China followed a similar development path as many industrialized nations, but at a larger scale and a quicker speed. With industrialization, car ownership exploded. From 1992, when I was born, until 2008, vehicle sales in China increased from about 2 million per year to almost 10 million. Predictably, the growth in city traffic, combined with weak regulation of industrial emissions that were fueled by coal, led to smog. But in the decade leading up to the Beijing Olympics, Beijing made $27.5 billion worth of investment into aggressive measures to clean up its air, including reducing coal use by nearly 1/5, closing heavily polluting industrial sites, doubling the number of public buses, limiting daily car use by license plate number, and taking older polluting cars off the road. During the Games, airborne particulate matter decreased from 50 to 30%. Researchers called it the largest effort made in human history to control air quality within a short period of time. But the Olympics were only a brief respite or window into a promised and better future. By 2013, the smog had come roaring back. Air pollution was contributing to 12.6% of all deaths in China, and in at least one province, air pollution was causing an economic loss equivalent to as much as 4% of the regional gross domestic product. The issue of pollution could no longer take second place to development. There was no denying one fact: something had to change. So in 2014, the Chinese government responded by declaring the upcoming decade a war on air pollution. They took the measures that had worked during the Beijing Olympics and implemented them nationwide. Again, more old cars were removed, industrial processes were cleaned, shut down, or relocated, and coal-fired boilers for wintertime were replaced with gas or electric. By 2017, Beijing had once again slashed its annual PM2.5 concentrations by 25%. Other cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen had achieved similar gains. Now, yes, many cities in China have air pollution levels still over WHO standards. There is still work to be done. But to put that into perspective, only 3% of the world's cities meet the WHO's air quality guidelines. No countries do. So what's notable here is the unprecedented speed at which China turned its situation around. By 2023, China's PM2.5 levels, despite a small increase, were 57% lower than they were in 2013. What's also interesting is how much China's city situations mirror those of nations that developed previously and are developing now. LA was once, like Beijing and now New Delhi, known as the smog capital of the world. And London's experience and response during the Great Smog in 1952 actually helped inform Chinese policymakers in China over half a century later. So what does this mean for China and the world? Most readily apparent are the benefits to human health. The average Chinese citizen's lifespan is now 2.2 years longer due to cleaner air. And in 2019, a peer-reviewed study looking back at the 2013 to 2017 National Air Pollution Control Plan found that the net economic benefit of the plan was equivalent to about $111 billion. What's more, cleaner air in China has also resulted in cleaner air, better health, and economic benefits for neighboring countries like South Korea and even places like California. Finally, a note on the climate crisis. Most air pollutants and greenhouse gases share a similar source, the burning of fossil fuels. Altogether, China's clean air actions from 2013 to 2020 had a climate code benefit equivalent to reducing global 2020 CO2 emissions by 5.5%. So while there are many ways to develop and grow, we only have one atmosphere. And to state the obvious, protecting that atmosphere is more than worth the cost to do so. Just like China learned from and built upon the successes of places like London, hopefully other developing nations can now look to China for lessons and do the same.
All right, your headlines once more. The European Union presses ahead with plans to impose steep tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, despite a divided vote.
China condemned the decision, accusing the EU of violating World Trade Organization rules and delaying its own green transition.
Relief for now as US dock workers end their strike action until next year.
And that is it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, Africa Live. We'll see you again next week, same time, same place. From all of us here in London, goodbye.
Bye-bye.